So, very good morning to all of you, and this is our next class on the Renaissance criticism. So, in our previous class, we have done the general characteristics of Renaissance, and in today's class, we will do the evolution of Renaissance criticism. Now, that if we take this Renaissance criticism as a journey, we will see that this journey has five specific stages, which shows the development and the evolution of Renaissance criticism. And throughout this journey, we will see, except the fifth stage or the last stage, there is an influence, that there is an Italian influence. Okay, so the first phase is the rhetorical phase, and in this phase we find that this particular in phase, there is the study of language and the literature. The study of language and literature was purely rhetorical, so they gave more importance and more stress on the rhetorical aspects of language and literature. And the most important work, the first work that was written, was Wilson's Art of Rhetoric. It was published in 1553. So in Art of Rhetoric, this particular book, about this book, Wharton says that this is the first book or system of criticism in English language. So it is the first book or system of criticism in English language that was said about the book by Wilson's Art of Rhetoric. The next book is very famous, that is Roger Ascham's The Schoolmaster. It was published in 1568, and in this book we find that this particular book was influenced by the Italian critical theories. So this particular book was influenced by the Italian critical theories, and he actually opposed to the romantic Italian spirit. So Ascham was against the romantic Italian spirit and its influence on the imaginative literature. So Ascham was actually against the romantic Italian spirit, and how this romantic spirit influences the imaginative literature. Roger Ascham was against that, and indeed he was a follower of the Italian humanist tradition, which actually had a tendency to follow the classical tradition. Now, this particular dual tendency or the tension you will find throughout the journey of literary criticism of Renaissance in England, that one particular group, they wanted to follow the Italian humanist tradition, and another group, they wanted to follow the romantic spirit that influenced the imaginative literature. So this tension you will find throughout the journey or throughout the evolution of literary criticism in England, which was influenced that started after Renaissance. And the most important thing is both the influences, they belong to the Italian tradition. Both were Italian. Okay, now Ascham's is the first English classicist. So we know that Ascham as the first English classicist, and and because he had the humanistic training. So Ascham was the follower of the Italian humanistic tradition, and he was known as the first English classicist. Another writer was Gabrielle Harvey. He was a representative of the rhetorical school of criticism. So Gabrielle Harvey is another name apart from Roger Ascham. He was the representative of the rhetorical school of criticism, and we find that during the rhetorical phase, there was more stress on the form and style rather than on the content. So study of the form and style of literature became more important rather than the content of the literature. And as a result, we find that during this stage there was a development and formation of a specific English prose style. Because they gave more importance on the form and style, there was a development and formation of a specific English prose style. Okay, now the second phase is the phase of classification and metrical studies. So the second phase is the phase of classification and metrical studies, and the second stage, in the second stage, we find the book by Puttenham. This book was Art of English Poesy. So Puttenham's book, Art of English Poesy, and it is the first book that dealt with the systematic classification of poetic forms and subjects. So Putnam's book systematically classified the poetic forms and subjects as well as the rhetorical figures. There were other books like Harvey's Letters and Webb's Discourses of English Poetry. So there were other books apart from Putnam's Art of English Poetry. There were Harvey's Letters and Webb's Discourse of English Poetry. These are the systematic attempts to introduce. So this book systematically attempted to introduce classical meters into English poetry. Please note it down. These books actually tried to introduce systematically classical meters into English poetry. Now here we will also get the name of the group known as the Areopagus, or the group of the Areopagus. Milton wrote his prose work on this name, and the name of the prose work is Areopagitica. Now, this group known as Areopagus and Sydney, whose essay Apology for Poetry we will study in this class. So Sydney was also a member of this group. And what did this Areopagus wanted to do? They were a group of poet scholars, and uh, and they wanted to study and classify the practical questions of language and versifications. So the Areopagus, they wanted to, first of all, they wanted to introduce classical meters into English poetry, as well as they wanted to study and classify the practical questions of language and versification. So I said that these groups and the other literary critics who wanted to develop the Renaissance tradition of English poetry and English literature, they wanted to give some aid to those writers who will be writing their poetry or any other imaginative work of art. Okay, so now what the Areopagus wanted to promote was the thing actually what Roger Ascham counteracted, that is the romantic spirit that we find in imaginative writings in English. So Roger Ascham was a follower of the classical tradition, and he followed the followed the Italian humanists, and he was against the romantic tradition of literature. And the Areopagus wanted to introduce that particular strain, giving more importance on the very practical questions of language and versification. And they also wanted to introduce the classical strain of classical meter into English poetry. So the study of verse forms introduced into English from Italy. So this study of verse forms was introduced into English from Italy, which was influenced by Italy, help to perfect the external side of English poetry. So English poetry had its own content. The internal aspect was there, the internal elements were there, and these influences actually formed the very external side of English poetry. And a similar result was obtained. He said that the similar result was obtained by the crude attempts at the use of Greek quantitative verse. So the refined attempts were made by following the Italian tradition, and the crude attempts were made by following the Greek quantitative verse. The Italian prosodists, directly or indirectly, were the masters of the New English poets and the English creative writers. So the Italian prosodists had a great influence on the English writers. Third phase is very important, that is a phase of apologetic criticism. And here we will find that in this particular phase we find writers like Sidney wrote Apology for Poetry, which was published in 1595. Now, what is apologetic criticism? Now, there were some Puritan writers and thinkers who believed that poetry was something which should be banished. Poetry has no merit of its own. Poetry is something which is extraneous to society. It has no need. It has no use, no utility. And poetry is a mere plaything. It makes men weak, and it is against the virility of men. It actually promotes many kind of ill, and it has ill effects on society. It is very much it tells upon the very social and moral structure of the society, so many things. So these were the objections that were laid down by certain Puritans against poetry. And a few creative writers, they started writing essays on essays supporting poetry, and they wanted to focus on this point that poetry has no immoral element in it. Poetry is not bad for society. It has its own good effects on society, but the problem lies with the abuse of poetry. One who abuses poetry, one who makes the bad use of poetry, is responsible for debasing poetry. But poetry itself is not uh, bad for the society. Now these were actually apologetic writings, and here we find that Sidney was the most important figure who wrote an apology for poetry in 1595. Now regarding Sidney's apology for poetry or defense of poetry, J.A. Symonds says that much as the Italian had recently written upon the theory of poetry, he says, much as the Italians had recently written upon the theory of poetry, I do not remember any treatise which can be said to have supplied the material or suggested the method of this apology. So, according to Simmons, the Italian influence has nothing to do with Sidney's apology for poetry. Sidney's apology has no trace of Italian influence in it. On the contrary, Spingram says the doctrines issued by Sidney had been receiving very similar treatment from the Italians for over half a century. So he says the doctrines that Sidney discussed in his Apology of Poetry had been receiving very similar treatments. So these things were already there, and they were receiving similar treatments similar treatment from the Italians over half a century, and it can be said without exaggeration. So he said that Swingram says that the Italian influence was there in Sidney's Apology for Poetry, that there is not one essential principle in the defense of poesy or apology for poetry which cannot be traced back to some Italian treatise on the poetic art. So he said that there is not a single issue in apology for poetry which was not there in the Italian tradition of apologetic criticism. So there were two types of reception of Sidney's Apology for Poetry. Some critics said that it has nothing to do with Italian influence and there was no Italian influence in it. And Springram and others critics, they believe that whatever Sidney has dealt with in his Apology for Poetry, all those things were there in Italy, and it was actually something that was taken from the Italian apologetic criticism. Now, the fourth stage was the beginning of classicism, and here we find writers like Ben Jonson. The fourth stage of Renaissance criticism, this occupies the first half of the 17th century. So these three stages, they belong to the 16th century. It started with 1563, 1568, and then 1595, Sidney's Apology for Poetry. Before that, 1568 was 1568 was Ascham's book Schoolmaster. So all this was 16th century writing, and the fourth stage started with the first half of the 17th century, and Ben Jonson is the most important critic of this age. Now, what was Ben Jonson's contribution to the development of English criticism? Regarding this, Pingram says that the period that preceded it, that the period that followed it, was in general romantic in tendencies. So what actually the period that preceded, that followed this, by romantic in tendencies, that of Johnson leaned towards a strict, though never servile classicism, but that Johnson actually was against, he actually shifted from this common strain, this common flow of romantic criticism, and he left his mark on the strong fields, on the strong ground of classicism, but his classicism was not an ape-like imitation of the earlier classical masters, but he actually adapted the classical values, the classical tradition, and the classical strains, and used that in his creative writings. So Johnson was never servile in following the classicism, in following classicism. Sydney's contemporaries has studied the general theory of poetry, not for the purpose of enunciating rules of dogmas or criticism. Now, Sydney and his group, they followed the classical rules, they studied the classical rules, but they were never dogmatic in their attitude. They were never very much strict about following this, but chiefly in order to defend the poetic art. They took the ideas from the classical tradition, from the classical beliefs, only to defend the poetic art, only to give answer to the objections raised by certain Puritan thinkers. That's why they took the ideas from the classical thinking. Okay, that was what Sidney and his followers did, who wrote apologetic criticism, and to understand its fundamental principles. Now, with Johnson, what happened? Sidney also followed the classical tradition, but his attitude, but his purpose was different. He wanted to use them to give answer to those objections raised by certain Puritan thinkers who were against poetry. But what David Johnson did, he's following the classical tradition was not a servile activity, but what he did with Johnson, the study of art of poetry became an inseparable guide to creation. He says that what Johnson did, he studied literary criticism only to help his creative productions, only to help create, only to develop his creative writing. His critical studies and creative activity go hand in hand, and it is this element of self-conscious art. This element of self-conscious art guided by the rules of criticism. So he said that his self-conscious art, his creative activities were guided by criticism, which distinguishes him from his predecessors. His predecessors either followed they imitated like an ape the classical traditions and the classical style and the classical dictum. But Ben Jonson adapted that only to give aid to his creative writings. So his creative writing and his following the classical rules and his critical and his critical studies go hand in hand only to complement each other. So this is the fourth stage, which was the stage which was the where Ben Jonson mainly ruled, and the fifth stage was the stage of neoclassicism and French influence. So this fifth period, the fifth stage, which covers the second half. Ben Jonson's stage was the first half of the 17th century, and this was the second half of the 17th century, which lies strictly speaking. And they actually, this particular stage, this particular phase went out of the influence of Renaissance criticism. So during this period, Italian influence is replaced by French influence. So now the English criticism actually it uh, came out of the influence of Italy, and it started getting influenced by the French creative and critical writers, and we witness the rise of neoclassicism with all its characteristic features. Now, here we find the rise of neoclassicism. Rationalism, the restriction of literature, these were the trends that we find in this particular phase, that is rationalism, restriction of literature to the imitation of nature. Literature is not just an imitation of nature, it is a combination of nature and nurture. That became the trend, with the further limitation of nature to the life of the city and the core. And now literature, content of literature not only dealt with nature and the natural elements, but also something which belonged to the city and the court life, and the confinement of imagination to it. Wit became more important than imagination and characterized literary inquiry, and all these trends actually characterize the literary inquiry of this period. And Dryden, John Dryden, is the literary figure of this period. Now, of these five stages, the third stage is the most important stage, and the writing that belong to this third stage, that will be the topic of our discussion in the class, in the following classes. The brief survey of the evolution of criticism during the Elizabethan age makes it clear that the most important stage in this evolution is the third stage. Now, throughout this study, we will find that the most important stage is the third stage, or the stage of apologetic criticism, where there was much thinking over the nature and function of poetry. Why this stage is important? Because this particular stage gave most importance not on rhetoric, not on versification, not on classical meters, not on following the classicism or other trends, but they give more importance on the nature and function of poetry. When we will study Sidney's Apology for Poetry, we will study what Sidney has said about the function and nature of poetry, how Sidney defines poetry. Poetry and all imaginative literature continued to be justified allegorically. So they were justified that these things, poetry and other imaginative literature and other creative literature, has their own importance in the society, and they were justified. Their need, their effect, their utility has been justified allegorically. Okay, the conception of poetry and the function of the poet that were raised high, that poetry is something which has a high stature, and the poets were not just mere human beings. They are the visionary people. They have the godlike power. They are the creator like God. Poets were regarded as spiritual legislators. So Sidney has said this in his Apology for Poetry, that poets were the spiritual legislators and they are the reformers. And the purpose of poetry, the function of poetry, which Sidney has pointed out in his Apology for Poetry, is not only to delight or to instruct, but both delight and instruct. It will instruct through delight. So the function of poetry in this apologetic criticism, if we find that the function of poetry is not only to entertain people or to instruct people, but to instruct through entertainment. To be truly and correctly understood, it was supposed poetry must be moralized and interpreted allegorically. So there will be moral teachings, there will be moral and ethical teachings in poetry, but all these things will be done allegorically. That's why it becomes more beautiful than any other thing that we find, any other mundane thing. Poetry in its highest form is the art of making. So poetry is what? It is the art of making, and the poet is the creator, he's the god. In the Roman language, the poet is known as a vatus, or one who creates, one who is a god. It can attain perfection. How poetry attain perfection? Only by divine instinct. So the poet needs a divine support, a divine influence, a divine instinct to create, and by a great excellence of nature, or by vast observation. So the poet's nature, he can observe the things vastly, he can see the things differently, and from that seeing comes the creation, which deals with the very common things, where the dealing becomes different. Okay, it is to be noted that even the Puritans and the moralists who attacked poetry acknowledged its greatness. Plato wanted to banish the poets and poetry from his ideal republic, but Plato was not against poetry. Then what is the thing that Sidney has pointed out, that Sidney has given stress in his Apology for Poetry, that just like us who believe that poetry is not bad, but the abuse of poetry is something objectionable. Plato's point was also like that, that abuse of poetry should be criticized, and those who abuse poetry, the bad poets, those who abuse poetry, those who make the bad use of poetry, they should be banished from the ideal republic, not the poet and poetry. Okay, so in the next class, we will directly go to the text of Sydney's Apology for Poetry. And in that class, we will begin with what were actually the attacks that Stephen Gozon has made in his School of Abuse, against which Sydney wrote his Apology for Poetry, which was published in 1595. And then we will move on to the text. And before going to the text, we will move on to the plan, the structure, and then to the text and the various aspects that Sydney has discussed in his apology for poetry. Till then, thank you for being with me. Have a nice time. Take care. Bye bye.